So thanks for having me to do the meeting tonight. I think it's obviously quite a kind of important discussion that we're having tonight. And what I want to try and do is we can have a sense that with the corona crisis, it's actually very, very difficult to like remember or sort of relate in the same way to like what the political context was before that, because it just seems so utterly kind of dominating. But I think it's something that's incredibly generalised across the world right now in terms of really shining a light on deep problems underlying in society. And if we go back to sort of looking at pre-corona crisis, one of the things that really marked the situation, I think, was the levels of polarisation that we're seeing in society, the collapse of the mainstream establishment as the system fails to account for the intensifying hardships in people's lives. The state of the world, like before this crisis kicked off, was already pretty dire and pretty polarised and pretty crisis-ridden. When you look at levels of inequality, austerity, poverty, how these things are hitting communities and driving people into polarising on one side or the other about what the answers to these questions are. The small matter of like ecological disaster and what's happening around the climate. So pre-crisis, corona crisis, we were already in a very crisis-ridden world that was creating a deep levels of polarisation in society. We were seeing the highest levels of racism and the rise of far-right movements and fascism since the 1930s. So of course, you look at somebody like Donald Trump, not a fascist, but kind of really captures this dynamic in society and right across Europe and Latin America and America itself, where you have somebody like Trump and the administration giving far-right and fascist forces confidence to organise and act. So we see a huge rise in hate crime. We see rise in far-right terror attacks. It's hard to go through all the examples actually that we've seen just in a short space of time, but Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Charleston, Finsbury Park Mosque, what happened to Joe Cox, Christchurch, Hull, that's just a small cluster of the number of quite shocking far-right or racist attacks that we've seen. And so I think what I wanted to do is to start by just trying to kind of have a bit of an understanding of the movements that are developing around us and how to organise to stop the far right and fascism, and then I'll sort of come on to like the current situation and how this is playing out with in this sort of even more sharpened situation of the corona crisis. But I think this question about what is fascism, what are these forces, it's not an academic discussion, it's not even historical, it's no longer purely a historical discussion. We have a situation where large swathes of Europe, fascists make up parts of the government. Latin America, we see the rise of far right in power. This process of polarisation or radicalisation is something that is flown out of the level of crisis we're experiencing in society. And it's not exclusively, of course, a growth of the far right and racist forces. We've had the experience of Corbynism here. In Scotland, we've seen, quite left-wing politics coming up inside the independence movement. We saw Sanders emerging, huge support for Sanders in the US. And this is a process we've also seen, across Europe. We can look at countries like Greece, where we can see, both sides of that polarisation very, very sharply. But it's also the case that this polarised situation is the ground in which fascist movements can grow and develop. And there's always been an interplay, I think, in what we call classical fascist movements and other kind of racist and populist nationalist ideas, far right and so on. And the tactics that you develop to deal with the fascists are different, I think, to how we would deal with other forms of racism, for example, from the Tories. Fascists have used, fascism is unique, it is unique, and it requires unique tactics to confront it. Its uniqueness is really smashing the left, working class organisations and democracy. And Trotsky's definition of fascism pointed out the two wings of classical fascism as the street army and the parliamentary wing. But fascists have used a different balance of tactics in different moments to seek ways to gain influence and power. So in the current situation, there's a whole spectrum of different forms that we see on the racist and on the far right, and a fluid dynamic, I think, between all these elements as they interact. And I just wanted to quickly kind of go through that a little bit to get a bit of the context that we're dealing with. So as we said, classical fascism, you think of, the kind of flag waving, open Hitler worshipping with a combination of a street army and a parliamentary strategy. So, you know, Golden Dawn is an example of this. You have Eurofascism, where you think of people like Le Pen in France, the FPO in Austria, who put on suits to look respectable, to make it into parliament. They've rebranded because since World War II, the classical fascist image is not so popular. We then have racist populism, which is something that we see massively on the rise at the moment, particularly when you look at America and when you look at what's happening in Britain, which is not fascist. You know, you think of Trump, Farage, Sebastian Kurz in Austria, and, you know, Johnson, I think, can sort of be seen in this category as well. And there are differences within these, but essentially all using a political platform to drag the agenda to the right, often an appeal to be seen as against the mainstream liberal establishment or previous governments and how they were interpreted, a tactic associated with the likes of Trump and Farage, but increasingly used by Johnson as well. And in a different way, Bolsonaro, who's more a far-right figure but not fascist, fits into this category. Leaders who use the state army and apparatus to increase dictatorship elements in the state. We then have the street armies, so we think of our own recent experience of the movement behind Nazi Tommy Robinson. You know, while Tommy Robinson and a lot of the forces leading that movement were fascist, it's not the case that everybody who went on those demonstrations or were organising around the football grounds and so on could be defined as fascist. You also have forces like the EDL, Pegida in Germany. And while the street armies are a key element of the fascist strategy, they're not necessarily always purely fascist movements. Look at the DFLA, the Democratic Football Lads, so-called Democratic Football Lads Alliance marches as an example of this. Then you've got the alt-right, you know, so we're looking at forces like Generation Identity, Steve Bannon, much of which is espousing fascist ideology, the Great Replacement theory and so on. But again, because it's an attempt to pull in wider layers, those who identify with the movement are more fluidly connected than purely being a wholly kind of fascist movement. And just because the fascists, such as the Eurofascists, for example, don't currently express in the form of the combination of parliamentary presence and street army, it doesn't mean they don't qualify as being fascist. So, you know, Wayman, co-convener of Stand Up to Racism, told us a story of when he was visiting Austria, and a bunch of the FBO people came out in the suits outside the Austrian Parliament and kind of, you know, came over in an intimidating way and said, you know, as soon as we're strong enough, we're going to liquidate you. So you can see that those politics and that goal is still something that's there. So yeah, we have these different sort of fluid kind of connected forces that exist in different ways in the world at the moment. Fascists operating within that and trying to use different tactics in different moments. And this isn't a new phenomenon. You know, in Italy and Germany, the clear examples of classical fascist movements. Mussolini and Hitler pursued strategies of drawing in wider sections of society, ideologically within intellectual circles, such as the futurists in Italy, identified with fascism. In Germany, this was also a process that took place. So we can define classical fascism with these two wings: parliamentary and street armies as a means of smashing democracy, smashing the left, and crucially smashing working class organisation. But as fascist movements have negotiated a route to this goal, they express in different forms. So, for example, in 1923, the German fascists went for purely street method with the beer hall putsch, which didn't work. In 1933, 32% of the vote grew, and they had 400,000 stormtroopers. So you can see that this is a process that they're constantly trying to organise around. I'm conscious of time and like the amount of stuff I've got down here. So I'm going to skip forwards a little bit. I mean, I suppose our aim really, like when looking at this situation, and certainly in the last few years with the polarization that we're discussing, the kind of incredible crises that are developing politically all across the world. This is obviously a big question for us to try and understand these forces. Our aim really is to splinter off the fascist core from the wider movements that they operate within, and to expose it from what it is to stop it growing, while obviously at the same time taking on the racism that we see coming from the state, the far right attempts to capitalise and so on. So, you know, we have our own recent experience of this with the threat of Tommy Robinson's street movements. You know, I thought it was an incredibly powerful example when Megaphone Man in the Northwest, in the midst of Robinson's campaign to try and get elected there. You know, you could look at Robinson at the end of the campaign where he only got 2% and he was defeated and he was deflated and he was on the telly. And he said, you know, the problem was that everywhere I went, people said, you're a Nazi. And we had, you know, SWP members should be proud that it was a comrade who was caught on film on that video that went viral, just following him and shouting, "You're a Nazi, you're a Nazi." This is an effective strategy to expose the Nazis in a similar way to, we're only a few days off the 10-year anniversary of defeating the BNP in Barking and Dagenham. It was a similar strategy that, it was the same strategy that was used there to go out and try and expose the fascists for what they are. I want to say something a little bit about the role of state racism and, I suppose, the removal of what you could call the cordon sanitaire, the idea that there were certain ideas or certain levels of racism that just were not deemed, acceptable even from racists in the establishment, and that there's been this process really of trying to break that and push the boundaries. And obviously Trump is a very good example of this, but Johnson also has his own, the comment about Muslim women wearing the niqab, the comments that he's, the whole list of absolutely shocking levels of racist comments that Johnson is documented as pushing. And so, a result of the ruling class struggling to politically deal with the depths of the economic crisis, they are ever reliant on the old crutch of racism to divide us and divert attention from those who are to blame. And you look at the question of the corona crisis and the level of which the pressure is on the government, the hatred that people must feel, the sense that the government are making decisions that are literally amounting to the murder of hundreds of, tens of thousands of working class people. This is something that I think not only did we already see that intensifying as a quite clear strategy of a turn towards racist populism from the state in Johnson's comments, but also in the first few months of the year. It's hard to remember, I think, sometimes what happened in the first few months of the year, but as soon as Johnson was elected, there was a whole raft of racist policies, from attacks on EU migrants to the hostile environment. There's too many to list actually in the time, but this was a very deliberate strategy that was used. And I think when you look at the question of how populism interplays in that situation, the polarisation, I suppose underpinning that, there are two explanations really for the mass articulated for the masses why living standards have been smashed up. One is our explanation for this, which is that the rich have completely shafted us, that there's a tiny minority in society which have got richer and richer, that we live in a society driven by putting profit before people, and that this drives this inequality and drives a situation where people's lives are completely unacceptable, and there's this frustration and struggle and so on. The other explanation that's put is that it's about immigration, it's about Muslims, it's about the great replacement theory, which is key ideologically to the rise of the far right and the alt-right, that Islamophobia is the sharp end of the wedge there, leading to a rise of more free expression of anti-Semitism and other older forms of racism. So this is a battle for ideas really that's been put out, and you have fascists in the far right trying to operate and capitalise on that in a moment of crisis, as they did in the 20s and the 30s, as a way that they found it possible to gain power. But you also have this coming from the state at the moment as well. The levels of Islamophobia. It was only yesterday, I think, that the stuff came back on the inquiry and the Tory party into Islamophobia. It's completely shocking that it's just been completely dismissed out of hand. The whole question of the hostile environment is deliberately about pushing this narrative. So I'm gonna jump on a bit. I mean, I was going to discuss some of the kind of international picture of the current state of things and where we have fascists as parts of government and so on, but I think I'll maybe leave that and we can come back in more detail in the discussion, because I think we probably all have a sense of that kind of wider picture at the moment, and the fact that we do have a growth of the far right that's driven by polarisation, and that looking at where we are at the moment with the threat of the corona crisis, I mean, I saw something this morning that said that the levels of anti-Chinese racism is risen by 21%. This is something that if you look at people like Salvini or Le Pen, or at the moment, if you look at their responses to the corona crisis, it is disgusting, like about trying to blame Chinese citizens living in those countries. It's about trying to make an argument about mass immigration and the crisis being bred in the camps and coming in, there's the use of disinformation and so on. is rampant. And then you look at what is happening in America, which is just terrifying. And people can comment on like, oh, these people must be really stupid, and but so on. But at the core of these protests, which are about denial of the virus, the sort of hatching onto all kinds of conspiracy theories, whether it's about the disease being developed in Chinese labs, or whether it's about it being put through phone networks, or whether it's about that it's all a myth and it doesn't really exist, and so on. This is an arena in which fascists are operating in the centre of these demonstrations quite openly, turning up with signs with swastikas on them, and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic slogans and so on. So this is quite worrying, because I don't know if other people have had this experience, but not necessarily in your immediate circles, but neighbours and stuff. Sometimes when you've had discussions about what's going on, I think because there's such a level of utter distrust in the politicians and in the establishment, and such a sense that something really dodgy is going on, that actually people's consciousness can be all over the place on these questions. And when you've got far right movements operating, it was interesting looking at some of the examples in Berlin, where there's been big demonstrations to break the lockdown and break social distancing, claiming that it's all hype, it's all whatever. There are actually some so-called, people that would see themselves as coming from a left-wing background, but buying into that conspiracy theory crap, really. And you look at what's happening around about those demonstrations, and they're being taken over by the far right. So this is a threat that we have to be aware of. I think, just to say briefly before I can try to sum up, is that we're in a situation in Britain where, the concerted efforts of Stand Up to Racism, and the trade union movement, and the massive demonstrations that we put on, and the urgency with which we took the threat of the rise of the far right, the importance of that whole process is really, I think, exposed very, very clearly in this moment. Because imagine we hadn't done that. Imagine we had not knocked back the forces of Tommy Robinson, the forces of the far right, what situation we would be in right now, with this level of crisis hitting, and this level of disorientation, and this level of fear in society. So I think that the methods that we've used about understanding that threat, not being dismissive of it, not being pessimistic about the ability to actually shape events and getting people out onto the streets and building mass broad movements, was effective. We did drive back the far right and fascist forces in Britain for the time being. But then you look at something like what's happening. So the government starts with a herd immunity strategy, which is an attack on all working class people. It's sort of, it's shocking. It's just the idea that, well, just a bunch of you are going to die, and we don't really care because the economy needs to keep going and so on. But actually, when you look at the disproportionate Black and ethnic minority deaths within that, it's so disproportionate, and it's a huge political issue in society at the moment, I think. And there's such a correlation between the policies that this government was releasing out in January and February around awful racist policies, and the institutionalised racism that lies behind the disproportionate Black deaths, and the strategy of sending everybody back to work. I don't know if people saw the example of the woman from Victoria Station, TSSA member, who died because somebody spat at her. But this is also about employers. She had put in requests to employers saying she didn't feel safe being put on front line. Like, there's complete no regard whatsoever for acknowledging the fact that disproportionate black deaths is an issue, as well as there's no regard for workers in general being forced to go back to work. And so I think, just to try and kind of sum up a bit, I think the question of taking on racism within this crisis is absolutely crucial, because we can see waiting in the wings the kind of forces that want to exploit this crisis. We can see the complete inability of the establishment to handle it, and we can see that kind of real battle that's going to play out inside communities about what the explanation for that is and what it means that we need to do. I think we have to take the lessons from the last few years about how we defeated Robinson and the forces of the far right. We have to understand that the establishment racism, the state racism that Johnson has pushed, continues to fan the flames and create the grounds for those forces to regroup. And what we do as the anti-racist movement at the moment, and what we do as socialists within an anti-racist movement, and trying to link that into other resistance. I mean, it's been really, really important to see what the counter to all this is the NHS workers who have come out and held up signs demanding PPE, the action groups that have started to hold socially distanced protests. All this stuff is about giving confidence and direction inside working class communities, and on a national level, fighting for workers to actually take action that they can take. We've got the big focus now around the 1st of June, where the forced return to work is going to take place. We have the teachers' union essentially taking a position that anyone, not officially, but anyone who organises and refuses to go back and uses health and safety legislation and so on will get support. There's a massive opportunity for us to get stuck in here and try and really create facts that provide an alternative direction to responding to this crisis that really takes on the system. And that's in a context where, the news has had to profile how important workers are in society. We're usually made to feel like we don't have any value, but right now in society, the bankers are useless, and that's clear to everybody. And the key workers and the people that go out and work in the shops and so on are the heroes of society and so on. So I think we really need to build up networks in our areas and different workforces and so on, where we can try and really push to get more and more examples of that action, where we're linking a very conscious, prominent argument about taking on racism and about the threat of racism within this crisis. And so I'll end there. Sorry to go on.